Continuing on page 121 with an explanation of how the length of day and night are formed by the sun's occupation of the houses. So in the very first paragraph there, the houses and the lunar mansions orbit Meru in a clockwise direction to the right. The sun and the planets occupy the houses also orbit Meru to the right. However, the terms of their individual movements, the sun and the other planets, enter and occupy the lunar mansions by orbiting Meru counterclockwise direction to the left. The planets then make both southward and northward journeys, so this would be the seasons basically, while the houses and the lunar mansions have no southward or northward path and no individual movements. They move over the same path and have always followed regardless of the sector they are traversing. So it's just giving a description of what we actually see in the sky happening, our view. And then below the quote there, the sun is the main indicator of the differences in time and so forth. Therefore, it is necessary to know, among other things, which house the sun is occupying in the regions of the 12 sectors at the times of the limits of the sun's northward and southward passages of the equinoxes. This will be explained. We're not going to go into that level of explanation, but first let us explain the spring equinox. And then the next paragraph, the above are the equinoxes over the direct center of the sectors. But to be more precise, within each sector, more than 30 equinoxes can occur. So each of the sectors can be divided into 30 parts, or what he describes as 30 solar days, and on each day a spring equinox will occur. So we divide all of that up, and as the sun moves, it enters into each of these different sections, is the way that I understood that. Patrick?
What it's actually referring to is the cynetic equinox point, and that it's moving counterclockwise over a period of, it takes, what is it, 21,000 years or something. But that each of the houses, like right now, that's when they talk about like the end of the age of Pisces going into Aquarius. We're like about 6 to 5 degrees Pisces, and in a little while, a couple hundred years, it will actually be in Aquarius.
Okay. So then it continues on here in the next paragraph. The same applies to the other areas, but there are exceptions. It mentions in some cases it could be divided into 31 or 32 parts. And then at the bottom, the months are named according to their full moon lunar mansions and designated as early, middle, and later. And so over 3 months we have, at some places it describes 4 seasons, and some places 6 seasons, but what we have in the 4 season approach here is 3 equal months basically going through that for each of the seasons. And then it goes on into quite a bit of detail about all of this and the movements of all of the different things as a part of that. And then on page 124 it says it can be looked at in even more detail, and talking about it in terms of the northern limit and the summer solstice and the autumn equinox and the limit of the sun's southern passageway with the winter solstice, and then the Aries to Aries, the sun makes a little over 365 clockwise orbits of Meru, which is basically 1 year's time. The limit of its southward passage of the winter solstice is the same way the limits of the northern summer journeys, as well as the spring and autumn equinoxes. So those are all divided into fairly even quarters, if you will. And then it says, I will discuss these in terms of scriptural references. And so he then goes into other sources to try and back up the positions that he is taking in terms of the descriptions being given here. And then on page 126, in the middle of the page, he begins a discussion of arguments regarding the methods of how these are calculated and so forth. And then on 127 provides some additional support in a lengthy quote. On page 128, he again goes into some additional sources to support all of this. On page 129, he describes at the top a little bit an alternate view of some of this, and mentions the term extensive refutation of all of these. So he's continuing his refutation of this. At the bottom of the page, he talks about other contrary arguments, that is, arguments that are wrong in his presentation or his view. Then by the bottom of page 130 in the long quote there, he's talking about the sun's travels, moving north and south from the view of the sky from the earth. And then on page 131 on the second line there, and it talks about the rays of the sun that travel to different regions, and what he's doing is differentiating between the disk of the sun itself and the rays of the sun that come out of that, and they talk about that and have some different discussions about that. The sun disk arguments are discussed at the bottom of that page, and then he also makes a comparison between the condensed Tantra, Kalachakra, and the Abhidharma approach to these. On page 132, he talks about how far does the sun travel each day, and he says 182 and a half days divided among the 50,000 Johana. 50,000 would be 450,000 miles, of course, but that would be way longer than what it could be on the actual physical planet Earth. As I pointed out before, the height above the Earth that the sun is located, that is said to be 86,000 yojana. 86,000 works out to 774,000 miles. The sun is actually about 92,000 or million miles. So just a little bit off in their understanding of how far that actually is away from us. And then in the last paragraph on the page, this is page 132, what is the reach of the sun's rays themselves? So it's talking about the disk initially and the placement, where is the disk itself, the actual sun, and then how about the rays and how far they are away, which of course he points out that depending on where you are, like if you're up on Mount Meru, it's going to be a little bit different than if you're down in a valley somewhere, which makes perfect sense. But the calculation is that it would be 12,500 yojana, which of course is a little bit less than 92 million miles, quite a bit less. And so then on page 133, during the sun's undulating revolution around Meru, here's where it talks about the different lengths. Here it's talking about different lengths of day and night. So as we move through the different seasons, we move past the equinox and into the other time periods, then the days get shorter, they get longer, and so forth. So we have this undulation. And the next paragraph, third paragraph, the way the night and day differ in length, so it goes into some description of that, as well as some specifics about lengths of time differences. When the sun reaches the limit of its northward journey at the central meridian of the central sector of the south, the length of the daytime is 36 hours. Interesting, considering that it's only 24 hours that it takes the Earth to rotate around one. So it kind of creates an interest in how they're actually measuring hours here. As a part of that, you would think that they would have a fairly accurate sense of what that is, but they may have a different sense of what they're describing as an hour. But I didn't see an end note or anything to describe that, which I would have expected here. Moving on to page 134, the nighttime also decreases to 24 hours. So if somehow or other the day, maybe because it's hot, it just seems like it's longer during the daytime. In the next paragraph, talks about supporting references from the Tantra and commentaries, as well as some points of doubt. And so then it goes through this from several points of view. It talks about it in terms of the Himalaya, and talks about it in India, in Kailash. It talks about it, then moving on to page 136, various arguments about that. And it says, your assertions therefore contradict these quotes. Somebody else making an argument about how he is presenting this. But he fights back and says, no, there is no contradiction. And then again, he goes through all of these in the Himalaya, in Kailash, in India, Tibet, in Bhutan, and China. Bhutan is another country, or at least there was at one time. It's now in an area that's part of China. And then in China and so forth, and goes through the arguments about each of these things and why it's not really different, even though it may sound or appear to be different here. And he goes through all of this a second time with all these different areas or regions as a part of that. And then finally on page 140 at the very bottom, he comes to his conclusion. Therefore, it should be known that within the 6 lands of Himalaya and so forth, and the corresponding regions of the 12 sectors, the varying lengths of day and night throughout the sun's northward and southern passages are due solely to the different positions of sunrise and sunset. Makes perfect sense to me. If you think about it, the days that get longer and the days here are different than the way they are in Oregon where I lived, or if you move to Alaska they're going to be different and so forth. And so different regions are going to experience daylight and nighttime differently at each time of year. The only exception being if you're right on the equator, so that it's always pretty close. Well, I guess even that would be different because of the equinox. It moves above and below the equator itself too. Anyway, because of the same reason, it should be known that the appearance times of the houses also vary. Okay, so actually seeing the constellations or seeing where those divisions would be in the sky would vary a little bit. And it gives a chart here down on the page. This is 141, down a little below the middle of the page for each of the different houses, Aries, Taurus, and so forth. It goes through and shows how the above and the below the equinox, we have then either they are getting longer or going the other direction, they are getting shorter at the same time. So how the movement back and forth between the northern sector and the southern sector in terms of the way that it is typically viewed from the Earth. But also recognizing that there are differences depending on where you are on the Earth, which it is pointed out here, at least for some of those parts, some of those places. Then on 142, in the third paragraph, in the Tantra and commentary, these appearance times are taught using the direct center of Kailash as the central southern sector as a basis. So Kailash, I'm assuming here that it's talking about the actual mountain of Kailash, which was a sacred mountain both to the Hindus and to the Buddhists, and so they all knew Mount Kailash by itself. But in other cases it's talking about that as a territory, so it's not just the mountain, but would be a region around that. But that seems to be the central core. Everything seems to be perceived as rotating around that. The way we think of it is rotating around the North Pole. Here they seem to think of it as rotating around Mount Kailash, or Mount Meru, as it is also known. And of Kailash, of the central southern sector as the basis, by the same reasoning used there, appearance times on other sectors can also be shown. And then he goes back through those from that the table that he gave, and it gives a little bit more explanation about each of those. So then we arrive finally at the third part of this chapter, the Gola of the Earth, the emergence of the seasons. And this is where he talks about there being 6 seasons as opposed to 4, or in, I think at least one case, talked about 12 seasons, the 4 seasons each divided into an early, a middle, and a late part. But here we have these 6 seasons, and so we have spring, the hot season, followed by the hot season, then summer, and then autumn, then early winter, and late winter. Well, at least some of that makes sense in terms of Arizona. We definitely have a hot season in June, and then we have our regular summer after that. But we don't really have too much of a winter, unless it's the few days of winter that we have sometime early in the season, and the few days of winter that we have later in the season at kind of random times during our so-called winter, anyway. So each of these then can also be divided into 2 sectors or 2 houses as a part of the description of this. And then on page 144, in the second paragraph, the seasons then are divided into 4 as follows. So he's combining the 2-part ones. The spring in the 3 southern sectors, the summer in the autumn, the 3, let's see, when the Aries, and then spring in the 3 southern sectors, summer in the 3 eastern sectors, autumn in the 3 northern sectors, and winter in the 3 western sectors. And in the last paragraph, there's the 12 smaller divisions of, talks about the 12 smaller divisions of the seasons, which were previously explained, so he doesn't go back through that again. So that is a very brief overview of a very complex chapter, which several places he points out that he didn't have time to go into detail about, in spite of the fact that this was a rather long chapter. But it does give us at least a little bit of a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the way this is understood as the external world, as viewed from the earth, in different places on the earth as a part of that. So next time we will go into some contradictions about Kalachakra and Abhidharma, some of which he's already addressed just a little bit in that. And we will also make the transition into the inner Kalachakra. We'll look at the first chapter of that as well. So that concludes our discussion for this week.